Chapter 15. Casper, the Assault on the Castle. Queen Mattea's letters did their job. 2 former princesses read her message about Tor's imprisonment and traveled to Marshwood at once to help their old protector. Queen Nolan and Queen Gretchen were here now on the mountain top with Mattea, Nolan, Casper, Sophia, and Opal. The morning sun shone bright in the sky, but no one admired the scenery, as all were focused on their mission. "Come on, boys!" Opal was shouting. "Put your backs into it!" Casper sucked in a breath and wiped sweat off his brow before getting back to work. He and Nolan were cranking the gears of a modified, oversized slingshot. Queen Nolan, a brilliant special weapons engineer, had designed the slingshot just for this use. The pouch of the slingshot was wrapped around the back of the giant boulder pinning the door of the lair. On either side of the mountaintop, the rescue team had dug holes and dropped in the posts of the slingshot. Long, rubbery bands stretched from either side of the pouch to either post, and gears on the posts drew the bands tighter and tighter as Nolan and Casper worked the cranks. "Almost there," called Sophia as she watched the brace holding the boulder in place. They put a short beam in place to hold the giant rock until the bands were tight enough to launch the boulder, and Casper looked over to see that the brace was about to snap from the tension. The bands wobbled with one final crank of the gears, the rock shook at its base, and suddenly the bracing beam snapped in half. With a deafening whooshing sound, the slingshot launched the boulder off the mountaintop. "There she goes!" yelled Opal. They all rushed to the edge of the mountaintop and watched as the giant boulder flew through the sky, over the forest, and into the land of Archwild on the far side of the mountain. It fell true to Queen Udaline's aim and crashed down into a watchtower standing on the border. The crash of wood and cracking of rock could be heard even from their distance away. Nolan raised his fist in victory. "Score 1 for Marshwood!" Suddenly the door of the lair, now free of the blockade, flipped open. Tor's enormous head emerged first, then the rest of his body as he flew out. His wings stretched wide, blotting out the morning sun. He flew high before gliding round in a wide circle over the forest. He let out one enormous roar and a burst of flame for show, and then he flew back to the mountain top and alighted in front of them.
"Oh, yes,"
he said with a deep-throated chuckle.
"That feels good. I'm hungry enough to eat a whale."
Tor looked down at the humans and seemed to recognize his rescuers. His ears flicked in surprise.
"Odaline? Gretchen, is that you?"
Casper looked back and saw Tor's former house guest smiling up at the dragon. Tor lowered his head with a fangy smile, and the former princesses greeted him and stretched out hands to scratch under his scales. He let out a moan of pleasure. Nolan coughed. "I hate to break up the reunion, Tor, but—" Tor lifted his head again and looked down at the prince.
"Yes, baby Nolan?"
Nolan harrumphed, which Casper thought sounded a lot like when Tor did it. Mattea stepped beside her son and looked up at the dragon. "He's right, Tor. We need your help." Quickly she explained what had happened to Littagale.
"Ingeborg the Black?"
Tor asked in angry surprise.
"The witch who helped that Archwild knight kill my cousin Notch? She's the one who did this?"
Queen Gretchen nodded up at him. "Aye, one and the same." Tor's skin under his scales radiated heat, and he started pacing and growling angry mutterings aimed at the witch. Casper leaned to whisper at Nolan. "Notch?" Queen Gretchen explained. "He was the dragon of Archwild many, many years ago. Notch had a missing scale on his chest that Tor told him repeatedly to get looked at, but Notch never did. Ingeborg used her magic to find the dragon's weakness, and she gave an Archwild knight a cursed spear that would go straight to the exposed flesh under the missing scale. Notch was killed, and the knight became king of Archwild. That was Deek's well, an ancestor, anyway." Steam shot out Tor's nose as he faced the direction of Archwild, and he let out a long growl.
"And now this Prince of Archwild has taken Littagale."
Mattea nodded. Concern for her daughter was clear on her face. Tor shot a flame out his mouth and growled.
"I'm going to barbecue this prince. I'll rain fire upon Archwild Castle so no stone remains unscorched. All will cower before Tor the Intolerant.
Nolan rolled his eyes and interrupted. "Yes, that's all well and good, but we have to save Littagale first. We can't destroy the castle while she's in it." Tor made a face.
"Oh, yes, I see your point. But I'm not good with finesse."
Casper took a breath. "That's where I come in. I'm going to sneak into the castle and find Littagale while you and Nolan create a diversion." Tor thought about this.
"What kind of diversion? I haven't gone on a proper rampage for decades. I don't want to look a fool. What do rampaging dragons do these days?
Nolan grinned, but otherwise ignored the dragon, kissed his wife, and headed for the goblin armor he'd brought along. Casper, we need to get moving. He's right, thought Casper. While we're out here, Littagale is... Worried, he went to retrieve the bag of supplies Mattea had packed them. Then he returned and faced the dragon. Tor, kneel down so we can mount up, would you? Tor lowered his body to let Casper climb on his back. A moment later, Nolan clambered up, dressed in his golden goblin armor. Both princes sat between the dragon's wings, and Casper marveled at the beauty of Tor's dark green scales catching the morning light.
You are considerably heavier than your sisters,
said Tor with a snort.
Hold on.
Casper gripped tight as Tor started to move toward the edge of the mountain. Good luck, called Queen Gretchen. Be careful, called Sophia. She had one arm around Mattea in a hug to comfort them both. Sock that deek once for me, Nolan, Opal shouted. Tor paused on the edge of the mountainside.
What kind of diversion?
He asked again. He craned his neck to see the princes on his back. Nolan lowered his golden helmet's visor. Tor, old boy, let's go get you some cows. A short time later, on the outskirts of Archwild Castle's land, Casper and Nolan slid off Tor's back and landed in the brush. Tor lowered himself in the brush as much as he could, like a tiger hiding in grass. Tor was by now full of cow, but the princes were starving, so they opened the bag of supplies to find what Mattea had packed for lunch. Nolan sniffed the open canteen. Ugh! Yup, Mom made this all right. Casper took a sniff. It smelled like tomato soup, but that was a gracious comparison. He quickly fastened the lid on the canteen and returned it to their pack, then strapped the pack over his back. Nolan continued to make a face as he blew the smell out his nostrils. Then he motioned for Casper to turn and see what they were dealing with. Together, the trio looked out at the sunlit castle's defenses. Along the high castle walls, 10 archers faced their direction. Down at the open drawbridge, 5 more guards paced on watch. Outside the castle walls, 50 to 100 soldiers were camped in archwild black tents. The border of this camp was lined with wooden spears stuck into the ground to ward off attacking horses. A few catapults were positioned along this border for additional defense. Between the camp border and the trio's position spread a long field, but Casper could still hear the ruckus of the camp. That's probably your best way in, said Nolan as he pointed. A servant's entry in the castle wall stood open. The bridge here was pulled back, but the moat was narrow and would be relatively easy to cross. Assuming there aren't crocodiles, thought Casper. He checked the dagger tucked into his jerkin and pulled up his boots, getting ready to sprint across the field. Nolan was studying the scene. These soldiers must be all that's left to defend the castle while King Archwild led the rest of the army to war. Tor looked positively green behind the gills. This is just an expression, as dragons don't have gills, but he looked pretty sickly.
I'm not going to be able to contain my excitement much longer. Can we get on with this, please?
Right. Nolan looked at Casper through his lowered visor. You ready? Casper got into a crouched position. As I'll ever be. With a deep breath, Nolan stood in his golden armor and shouted, For my sister and for Marshwood! Ah! And charged out into the open field. This drew the surprised attention of many Archwild soldiers, and men grabbed their weapons. Commanders gave orders, and a handful of troops charged out to meet Nolan. Nolan met the first soldier in the middle of the field and made an impressive spin move, swiping with his sword to knock the soldier off his feet. 2 more soldiers met Nolan, but he dodged their swords and leaned back, sliding on his knees past them before coming around and taking them out as they turned. Then 3 soldiers surrounded Nolan, but he swung and sliced and kicked and thrust his sword until they'd all fallen. An Archwild commander gave another order, and 20 more troops rushed out to meet Nolan. Ha! The commander laughed from behind the spear defenses. Impressive, but you'll have to do better than that. Are you all alone, fool? Nolan held perfectly still on the field. The soldiers approaching grew nearer. Nolan turned and yelled back to Tor, Hello! That's your cue! Tor started beside Casper.
Oh, oops.
With a mighty roar, the dragon stood on his hind legs and beat his wings, rising into the air.
I am Tor the Intolerant, and you will pay for taking my princess.
The soldiers marching toward Nolan slammed into each other in a halt. Nolan raised his sword and charged, Tor flying right behind him. The soldiers turned and ran back to their camp, but it was no use. A stream of fire erupted from Tor's open, roaring mouth, and flames caught the soldiers. Most of them remembered what little training they'd had for such occasions and stopped, dropped, and rolled. Nolan continued to charge, and the braver soldiers met him and fought while Tor swooped overhead again and again, shooting flames at the camp. Caspar knew this was as good a diversion as he was going to get. Jumping up, he ran at full speed across the open field. He didn't look at Tor's attack as he focused on his destination, but he heard screams and war cries and the flapping of dragon wings. It sounded like a great battle was raging. Suddenly, right before Caspar reached the castle moat, a loud rumble shook the air. He knew what this meant and threw himself to the ground just as green gas fumes swept overhead. He covered his face on instinct and stayed down. A second later, the fumes ignited and became a cloud of flames, and Caspar could feel the heat overhead. The flames burned out the next instant, and Caspar sat up to look around. The Archwell camp was charred and smoking. A smoky mushroom cloud rolled overhead in the sky. A few singed soldiers were doubled over, coughing and gagging. Most lay unconscious, from the fight, fumes, or fire Caspar didn't know. One scorched soldier emerged out of the smoke. He dragged his sword through the blackened dirt and wandered without watching his footing, only staring straight ahead. He came to stand a short distance from Caspar. The man's eyes were wide in horror. "What?" Caspar looked around. "What happened?" The man shook his head. "There's no coming back from that. I surrender." With that, the man fell over in a faint. Caspar looked up and saw Tor fly overhead. Riding on the dragon's back, Nolan waved his sword at the few remaining soldiers below, his golden armor reflecting the sunlight. A little burst of green gas lifted Tor's tail, and the gas went up in a burst of fire as the dragon flew on. Caspar had to chuckle. "They're doing their job," he thought. "Time for me to do mine." He stood, adjusted the pack on his back, drew his dagger, and faced the castle wall. He hopped the narrow moat and held his breath, but the moat apparently was crocodile-free. Hurrying to the open servants' entry, Caspar stepped through the doorway into the castle.